Shalom. I'm going to be getting into this book that seems like it's pretty popular among Hebrews. A lot of people like to quote from this book, but I see it's usually only little sections people quoting, and people really don't get the context of what's going on in the book. So, The Origins of the American Indians by Lee Huddleston. I wish I had a little stand for it, but I don't, so I'm gonna do it my way. All right, so this book I'm reading for educational and criticism purposes. I don't think I said that right, but y'all know what I meant. So, starting off with the introduction, the discovery of the American Indian. When Columbus returned to Europe in late 1492, he wrote a letter to his patrons, Ferdinand and Isabel, informing them of his discoveries in the Western Sea. He told them of the islands, the plants, the animals, and the people and he had encountered there. The people of this island, Hispaniola, and all the other islands which I have found and of which I have information, all go naked, although some of the women cover a single place with a leaf of a plant or with a net of cotton. This letter was subsequently published and went through several editions in various languages before the end of the century. Many Europeans received their first information of the New World from this letter, but it was singularly informative about the nature of the inhabitants. They do not hold any, this is the beginning of the actual letter. They do not hold any creed, nor are they idolaters, but they all believe that power and good are in the heaven, and were very firmly convicted that I, with these ships and men, came from the heavens. In this belief, they everywhere received me after they had mastered their fear. This belief is not the result of ignorance, for they are, on the contrary, of very acute intelligence, and they are all men who navigate all those seas, so that it is amazing how good an account they give of everything. It is because they have never seen people clothed or ships of such a kind. In all these islands, I saw no great diversity in the appearance of the people or in their manners and language. On the contrary, they all understand one another. In none of these statements did Columbus indicate any surprise at the presence of men in these islands he found, nor is there any evidence of such concern in the remnants of his journal. His first comments on the Indians appear under the date October 11th, 1492. In what de las Casas, or Las Casas, whose notes on the journal are all that remain of it, says, to the admiral's own words, Columbus described the Indians as very friendly, with short, coarse hair, like, go on, Tekka, go on. I'm going to start over here from Columbus. Columbus described the Indians as very friendly, with short, coarse hair like that of a horse's tail, and of good stature. Columbus also noted under the date October 13th, 1492, that their eyes were large and beautiful, and that they had... Also noted under the date October 13th, 1492, that their eyes were large and beautiful, and that they are not at all black, but the color of the Canarians, and nothing else could be expected, since this is one line from the east to west with the island of Hierro in the Canaries, or Hierro, I think. There is no reason to expect Columbus to puzzle over the presence of men in the newly discovered lands, as it is clear from reading his first letter and his journal. Columbus thought he had discovered some islands off the coast of Cathay. Cathay is China, I'm pretty sure. Thus, he had no reason to wonder where the inhabitants could have came from. Later writers made much of the belief that Columbus identified Hispaniola with the Ophir of Solomon. This belief stems from Pedro Martir de Alegrias, something like that, Decadas. This island of Hispaniola, which he affirmed to be Ophir, of which the third book of Kings speaks. Whether Columbus actually made an identification or not is of little importance. The belief that he had done so was widespread and influenced subsequent writers who wished to locate Ophir with the West Indies. It should be noted, however, that for Columbus to locate Ophir in the Indies in 1492 would not have been the same implications as a similar placement by Cabello Balboa in 1580, and Columbus's time. Most writers thought Ophir to be in the West Indies of Asia, and Columbus's identification of Hispaniola as Ophir did not take Ophir out of Asia. So to make the same identification after 1522 would require a conscious break with tradition and elaborate reasons for placing Ophir in an unknown section of the world. Columbus did not question the existence of men in the New World because he did not know it was a new world. The realization of this fact was a gradual one, not fully made until reports of the Magellan expedition of 1519 to 1521 became available. There was therefore no reason to marvel at the New World filled with new men, because neither phenomenon was recognized as such. The first must be understood before the second could be considered. A generation passed between the discovery and identification of America as a new world. In the interim, numerous accounts of the Indies appeared in Europe, but few revealed any great concern for the population of the newfound lands. Bas de Camina of Corporal's expedition devoted only a brief section of his report to the natives of Brazil. In subsequent comments in Columbus's journal revealed no growing concern for the inhabitants. Amerigo Vespucci did such a good job of popularizing the New World in Europe that many Northern Europeans agreed with the British poet, dramatist John Rastell when he wrote in 1520 that the Indies been called America by cause only Americans did first find. Let's try that again. Been called America by because only Americans did first them find. Leaving aside for the moment the question of what Vespucci meant by the phrase Mundas Novas, his writings revealed no comprehension that the New World of the type of America proved to be would pose serious problems about the origin of the inhabitants. How did they get to the New World? Where did they come from? And from what people were they descended? Vespucci's comments on the population of the New World were very brief and almost totally uninformative. In his first published letter in July 18th, 1500, he reported that the Indians were beardless, brown, naked, cannibal, and they had various languages. At the time, however, Vespucci still believed the New World to be bounded by the eastern parts of Asia, because we saw diverse animals such as lions, stags, goats, which are not found on islands but only on the mainland. In his Lisbon letter, Vespucci described the natives of Brazil as cruel and warlike and ignorant of law, religion, rulers, immortality of the soul, and private property. By 1503, Vespucci had seen so much of the coast of America from southern Argentina to the Carolinas that he had become convinced that it could not be Asia. Consequently, when he prepared his essay on the new lands, he chose to give it the title Mundas Novas, New World. Later writers have taken Vespucci's use of the phrase Mundas Novas to indicate that Vespucci guessed that America was a distinct geographical entity, different from Asia, Europe, and Africa. A careful reading of Vespucci does not clearly indicate that was what he had in mind. Considering the general concept of the worlds in those days, it may well be that he chose to call America Mundas Novas to indicate that the world he was describing was unknown to the ancients. Vespucci's last letter in 1506 does not clarify his meaning in Mundas Novas, but it does contribute a few more elements to his description of the Indians. They were reddish, but he thought that they would be white since they were not consequently exposed to the sun. Vespucci continued with the assertion that they have broad faces so that their appearance may be that of Tartar. This appearance to be the earliest comparison of the Indians with the Tartars, a practice which would become exceedingly frequent in the future. But it would be improper to postulate that Vespucci imagined that Tartar origin for the American Indians. His intent probably was merely descriptive. It seems likely that Vespucci did not suspect the true geographical relationship of America to Asia. He was certain that America was not Asia He was certain that America was not the Asia of travelers, such as John of Capernaum, or the Polos, or of Portuguese navigators, but he appears to have retained his belief that America was bound by the eastern parts of Asia. This would explain why it never occurred to him, in print at least, to wonder how the Indians got to the New World. The recognition that the presence of the Indian in the New World did pose a problem begins to emerge in the work of Pedro Martir de Ancaleria. I don't know how you pronounce that, but that sounds good to me. He completed and published the first book of his Décadas del Nuevo Mundo in 1511. Two additional books followed in 1516, a fourth in 1521, and the rest of the work by 1530. In the composition of his work, Angalera relied heavily on first-hand reports from conquistadores. Among his informants was Martín Fernández de Enciso, an important figure in the conquest of Darien, a major enemy of Balboa. Fernández de Enciso wrote his own Suma de Geografía que trata de todas las partes y provincias del mundo, en especial de las Indias, which contained little of importance on the West Indies. The volume was later translated into English and presented to Henry VIII as Roger Barlow's Summe de Geographia. And Galeria's Decadas proved popular. The original editions were issued in Latin. The first Decada was translated into German, English, Dutch, Latin, and the second and third appeared in French and English. The entire work appeared in English in unabridged form in 1577 and complete form in 1607. In 1607, English translation was made from the French translation of 1587. The Decadas did not appear in Spanish until 1892. And Galeria's history was largely narrative and chronological, but he occasionally offered opinions on contested matters. In at least 2 instances, he referred to the supposition that Solomon's Ophir was located in the Indies. Once in claiming that Columbus identified Hispaniola as Ophir, and again in suggesting that Solomon sent his ships to Hispaniola. In neither case did Angulera indicate that he thought Solomon's crew might have left a nucleus of people who could have produced the American Indians. Later in reporting the discovery of Columbus of fair-skinned youths near the equator, Angulera attributed this fairness in latitudes normally indicated by dark-skinned peoples to the curvature of the earth, which placed the peoples nearer to heaven, thus negating the effects of the sun. Latter still, Angulera attributed to Pinzon a comparison of some Indians to the Scythians. They were nomads like Scythians. Returning to Pinzon much later, Angulera recounted the story of contact between Pinzon and some of the Indians of Paria in 1514. The Parians presented the Spanish with a barrel of incense, which led Pinzon to conclude that incense must grow in Paria, since the natives of Paria have no communication with the Sabayos, the people of southwestern Arabia, as they absolutely nothing beyond their beaches. As they know absolutely nothing beyond their beaches. Only once did Angulera point out contacts of non-Americans with the Indians, which might have left a permanent population. In discussing Balboa's encounter with some Negroes on the Atlantic coast of Panama, he attributed to Balboa the postulate that an Ethiopian raiding party was shipwrecked in Panama, thus accounting for the Negroes down there. Peter Martyr also reported the practices of circumcision in the Yucatan, which Indians attributed to a former visitor. He did not, however, say he thought this might indicate a Jewish origin for the Yucatan Indians. Angulera did not consider the question how the natives got to America, for whom they descended. The first complete edition of Decadas appeared 9 years after the return of Magellan's voyage, or the Magellan Voyage. And Angulera, who died in 1526, 5 years after the Pacific voyagers returned, should have been aware of the difficulties involved in an assumption that the Indians had come from Asia. Yet despite the great width of the Pacific, he does not appear to have grasped the seriousness of the difficulties. It was left to the English poet-dramatist John Rastell to ask the questions in print. In his A New Interlude and Mary of the Nature of the Elements. And what a great and meritorious deed, a meritorious deed it were to have the people instructed to live more virtuously and to learn to know of man and matter, and also to know of God and their Maker, which as yet live all bestly, for they neither know God nor the devil, nor never hard tell of heaven nor hell, writing nor scripture, but yet in the stead of God Almighty, the honor some of his great light, for they doeth get them pleasure, but how the people first begun in the century whence they came, for clerks it is a question. That was brutal. That is some poor spelling, but really it's Old English, so. It is profitable that none of the men who carried the burden of the discussion of the problem of the Indian origins ever read Rastell, nor was that necessary. The problem was one which would readily occur to men of the early 16th century. So long as America was thought to be part of Asia, or at least it appears that Europeans automatically assumed that the inhabitants of the New World were of Asiatic derivation. But when the growing evidence capped by the Magellan expedition proved that the known parts of America were further from Asia than from Europe, this neat explanation of the presence of men in America was no longer tenable. It was almost universally believed in Europe in the early 16th century that all men were derived primarily from Adam and Eve, and secondarily from Noah and the other survivors of the flood. Animals as well as men could be traced to Noah's Ark, and all the men and animals in the world, despite their present locations, must be traced to the Ark. Tradition had that Eden, the original home of men, was somewhere in the Near East. There was some dispute over its precise location, but the consensus was definitely in favor of Mesopotamia. But the exact location did not become an important factor in tracing the first men in America until the 20th century. What was the most important to the early commentators on the subject of Indian origins was the location of the landing place of the Ark. Here again, tradition favored the Near East, Armenia. And since only 8 humans survived the flood, all modern peoples had to be traced to those 8 in Armenia, and to Armenia. It was not difficult to understand how the children of the Ark could multiply and spread over the continent of Asia, Africa, and Europe, inasmuch as these continents were all part of one great landmass, and was so easy to comprehend that the islands adjacent to the continents would likewise be filled with men. Since Noah no doubt passed the art of navigation along to his children and grandchildren, Renaissance man likewise readily understood that the animals could be spread over the Afro-Eurasia landmass with little trouble. They thought also that the nearby islands could be inhabited by animals who swam there or were carried there by men for their own purposes. But how did men get to America? When did they go? From what part of the old world had they departed? And from what known people were they descended? Writers did not credit the statement attributed to the Paracelsus that maybe God created a second Adam for America. These questions addressed originally to the problem posed by man's presence in a genuine new world. Must evidentially be applied to the animals also. Eventually be applied to the animals also. For they no less than man were children of the Ark. These considerations became current in the literature on America in the 1530s. few books printed after the date were able to avoid a review of these problems. Many of them include at least a passage, I don't know where that came from, at least a few pages offering solutions to the questions. But few writers accepted without modification the views of others. By 1530, the seriousness of the problem posed by the presence of men in the New World was only partly comprehended. For the most part, American Indian dominated the debate. The question of the animals entered the theorizing near the end of the 16th century. The period from about 1530 to 1607 was characterized by a brief and simplistic solutions. The only important exception was the comprehensive review of all phases of the matter of Joseph de Acosta in 1589-90, and a few unpublished works in the 1580s. In 1607, the great importance of the question at hand was pointed up by the publication of the first book devoted exclusively to the subject of Americans' origins. The first edition of Georgia Garcia's Origen de los Indios del Nuevo Mundo appeared in that year. In 122 years separating the first and the second editions of that book, debate involved a few of the great minds in Europe and became an integral part of such problems as the theological discussion of the universality of the flood, the readmission of the Jews to England, the legitimacy of European national claims to the Indies, and the various scientific and esoteric matters. Origen de los Indios was republished in 1729 with considerable additions by Andrés González de Barcia Calvadillo y Zunguilla. Barcia's editions increased the size of the volume perhaps a quarter, but they consisted of bibliographical entries and summaries of later opinions. The first 200 years of the investigation into the problems raised by the existence of unknown men to the America show a remarkable, I'm starting that paragraph over. The first 200 years of the investigation into the problems raised by the existence of unknown men in America show a remarkably unity despite the fantastic variety of solutions suggested. The methodology utilized by the majority of the writers was essentially deductive, exegetical, with minimum reliance on or even recognition of experience as a factor. Yet at the same time, there was a persistent theme of skepticism and caution running through the thinking of several writers. As in most cases of controversy in this period, the question of Indian origins was limited by the necessity to conform to Christian theology. Some writers spent much of their time on the subject, analyzing the various pages of the scriptures which could conceivably be related to the matter. Sometimes the preferred solution would rely wholly on evidences and deductions from biblical literature. Alternatively, an author might offer a solution derived from accepted ancient authorities. Many writers freely mixed ancient and scriptural references. The latter practice was probably typical. As Arnold Williams adequately indicated in his study of the commentaries on Genesis in the 16th and 17th centuries, most Europeans did not distinguish between the Bible and traditional interpretations associated with it. Many men active in the debate on Indian origins drew much of their knowledge of the ancient texts from scriptural commentaries rather than from texts themselves. At no time in the period before 1729 did anyone offer an origin theory which could not be made consistent with the Bible. Sometimes, as in the case of Isaac de la Péride or something like that, and his postulate of the evidence of man before Adam and the rationalization was openly contrary to the concept of tradition, but La Perriere made an effort. Experience was at no time denied, not even by the most credulous writers. From the earliest dates of the 16th century, writers on America recognized that the experiences of the generation of the conquest refuted many of the classical authorities, notably Aristotle, St. Augustine, and others who had argued that man could not live in the burning zone, nor cross into uninhabited any possible southern continent or Antipolis. Here was an obvious instance where Europeans could recognize that it is certain that practice is of more value than theory. Acosta, as well as several others, spent much of the early parts of his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias disproving Aristotle and St. Augustine with references to recent experiences. There was no sweeping rejection of authority in those instances where experience obviously contradicted the ancients. The ancients were indeed rejected, but this rejection was particular rather than general. Throughout the 2 centuries, the tendency was to accept the testimony of the ancient authorities, except in those areas specifically contradicted by experience. The result was a curious mixture of the observance and obscurantism, especially prevailed in the 16th century and continuing through the period in parts of Europe, notably in Holland and England, and in certain individual cases, the emphasis began to shift away from the over-reliances on authority toward a greater adherence to experience and to arguments drawn from the natural science. Late in the 17th century, the French naturalists began to show an interest in the origins of the Indians, and the debate began to take a distinctly non-theological character, although it never shed all its theological elements. This essay concerns the debate over the origins of the American Indian in the 2 centuries before it came distinguished from the question of the origins of their cultures, and before it began to take on the characteristics of a scientific dispute. In the period from 1492 to 1729, the problem of the Indian origins was distinct from the general problem of human origins. The highly restricted time scheme accepted by Europeans in those days did not allow a separation of the two. The time between the Deluge and 1500 covered at most some 4,000 years. That was little enough time to allow men to reach their historic locations. Polygenism, the belief in multiple origins for men, though attributed to Paracelsus in 1520 and definitely supported by La Perriere in 1655, was not seriously considered until the late 19th century. The age-conceived question of human, and therefore Indian origin, as largely theological, but many non-theological considerations were apparent from the beginning and gradually increased in importance throughout the period. Nonetheless, the extra theological considerations, geographical, ethnological, and the funal distribution operated within limits imposed by theology. Given the common diversion of the men and the brief time of man on earth, a large measure of cultural conformity between widely separated tribal groups must be assumed. Consequently, the method for discovering the origins of an isolated tribe consisting of tracing its cultural affinities with known peoples. Most writers of the period assumed that close cultural similarities indicated a common ancestry. This method dominated the entire first 2 centuries, but not without considerable questioning, as it is its vitality. 2 clearly distinguished traditions have emerged from my investigation: the Acosten and the Garcian. The first marked by a skepticism with regard to cultural comparisons, considerable restraint in constructing theories, and the great reliance on geographical and funal considerations is named for Joseph de Acosta, who gave it its earliest clear expression in his Historia Natural y Moral of 1589/1590. The Garcian tradition, named for the author of the Origen de los Indios, is characterized by a strong adherence to ethnological comparisons, a tendency to accept transatlantic migrations, and an acceptance of possible origins as probable origins.